The NFL draft is almost over, and Minnesota Vikings fans have a feeling that I don't know if they've ever had before, because I'm right there with them. The Minnesota Vikings and their draft have us all feeling a certain way. And there was a video that I found. This is going back to yesteryear, way back in the day, that I think accurately demonstrates this feeling Minnesota Vikings fans have had since Thursday evening when they drafted JJ McCarthy and Dallas Turner. I don't know if you guys ever watched Richard Simmons dance into the oldies locomotion style, but I think that's how all Minnesota Vikings fans are feeling. They are on such a cloud right now. And eventually this cloud is going to bypass us and we're going to get back to reality of losing football games and failing to win Super Bowls. But there's going to be a day when the Minnesota Vikings put it together. And that day might be happening very, very soon because of what they did in this year's NFL draft. But I want to discuss something else too, because this has been making the rounds, and it is Sean Payton and his comments after the NFL draft round one about baiting the Minnesota Vikings to trade up and draft JJ McCarthy. Now, the question that needs to be answered is, was Sean Payton right by making those comments or by alluding to those comments? Well, the Minnesota Vikings were at pick number 11. They traded up only one spot with the New York Jets, who weren't necessarily at all looking to draft a quarterback in this year's NFL draft. So that tells me that the Minnesota Vikings traded up to stop somebody else from taking that number 10 overall spot. So whether it was Sean Payton or the Las Vegas Raiders, there was some team that put fear in Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah's eyes in order to make that trade up only one spot to secure their guy, JJ McCarthy. Now, a lot of people hate Sean Payton, and I'm one of them. I'm not a big fan of Sean Payton. Hate's a strong word, but I'm not a big fan of Sean Payton. I do think he's a brilliant offensive mind, but of course, he also had Drew Brees, one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time. It's helpful to have one of those guys if you want to look like a brilliant offensive mind. But Sean Payton has a good history of winning football games in the NFL. And what Minnesota Vikings fans are going to point to is 2009 Bountygate against Brett Favre. So as soon as Sean Payton says a single word, that red flag goes up because we can't stand that guy. He's a cheater. He's arrogant. He's cocky. But when you look at what the Minnesota Vikings did and you look at Sean Payton's comments, it was either him or the Las Vegas Raiders that forced the Minnesota Vikings' hand to trade up to that number 10 overall spot. So yes, some team or someone baited the Minnesota Vikings. Now the question is this: were they actually baiting the Minnesota Vikings to draft JJ McCarthy? Or did they try to trade up themselves and this is just his defense mechanism because they weren't able to get the quarterback that they wanted in this year's NFL draft? That's the question. But regardless, the Minnesota Vikings had to trade up to number 10. So whether it was a bait or a failure by Sean Payton to get to that number 10 spot, it was something. And of course, Sean Payton isn't going to come to the podium and say, you know what? I failed. We failed as an organization, and the Minnesota Vikings got us. Because Sean Payton, as much as we dislike him, he's the one that got suspended for an entire year. He's the one that had the Minneapolis Miracle forced against him. So Sean Payton hates the Minnesota Vikings as much as we hate Sean Payton. So what was it? Did he bait the Minnesota Vikings, or did he fail to trade up to the number 10 spot? It was one of those two. Something happened for the Minnesota Vikings to trade up to number 10. Which was it? Not entirely sure. It could have been a complete failure because they got stuck with Bo Nix. And maybe they wanted JJ McCarthy. But maybe the Jets didn't want to trade back that far with the Denver Broncos, which was just a few spots further down than the Minnesota Vikings, to get the guy that they ended up getting in this NFL draft. So it's a fun conversation to have. It doesn't really matter. People are going to be offended regardless because it's Sean Payton. And as soon as Sean Payton comments about anything, Minnesota Vikings fans are going to erupt because of what he did and what he costed the Minnesota Vikings back in 2009. That is something Minnesota Vikings fans from this generation, from the generation of Brett Favre in 2009, are never, ever, ever going to forget. And Sean Payton, he's never going to forget it either, because it got him a Super Bowl, but then he also got suspended for an entire year because of mounting it. I actually watched the Netflix movie starring Kevin James with my wife a couple of months back. Kind of a lame movie, to be honest. I thought it kind of sucked. But that's what he did during Zero Off when he was suspended because of his cheating scandal. Anyway, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please hit that subscribe button right there. Right there. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you're listening to this podcast. Everyone, thank you for making this podcast and this episode a part of your day.